Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The pre-dawn darkness clung to the shoreline of Oahu's north shore. The beach empty, save for a lone figure moving purposefully toward the water. Kai Mitchell adjusted the leash on his ankle and gazed out at the breaking waves, barely visible in the gathering light. At 34, he'd been surfing these waters since he was a child, his body carrying the memory of countless waves in its muscle fibers. The scent of salt and plumeria hung in the air, a familiar perfume that always felt like home. Going to be a good one today, he murmured to himself, tucking a strand of sun-bleached hair behind his ear. The forecast had predicted 6 to 8 foot swells, nothing monstrous by North Shore standards, but clean and consistent. Perfect for an early morning session, before he had to lead a group of tourists on a snorkeling excursion at 10. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, a thin line of gold pushing against the darkness. Kai preferred it this way, having the ocean to himself before the crowds arrived. Weekday mornings at Pipeline were as close to solitude as one could get on Oahu these days, with tourism rebounding and the island again swelling with visitors, eager for their slice of paradise. Kai waxed his board methodically, the motion so familiar he barely needed to look down. The board was a custom 6'2" thruster, shaped by a friend from Halewa, who understood exactly how Kai liked to ride. Not too flashy, just clean white with a single blue stripe running down the center. Professional surfers with their logo-covered boards and entourages had never appealed to him. For Kai, surfing wasn't about sponsorships or competitions. It was communion with the ocean, a relationship built over decades. The waters off the North Shore were relatively warm this September morning, hovering around 78 degrees. No wetsuit necessary, just board shorts and a thin rash guard to protect against the sun that would soon be climbing into the sky. Kai had checked the tide charts last night. The tide was pushing in, which would make the reef break slightly less hazardous. Still, he knew better than to get complacent. Pipeline earned its reputation from the shallow reef that created its perfect barrels, but also claimed its share of injuries. Kai walked into the water until it reached his waist, then laid his board flat and crawled onto it, paddling out toward the break with strong, practiced strokes. The shoreline receded behind him as he navigated through the channel, avoiding the impact zone where waves were already breaking with impressive force. His eyes scanned the water constantly, alert for any signs of unusual movement. The ocean demanded respect, and over the years Kai had developed an almost preternatural awareness of its moods and dangers. 200 yards from shore, he sat up on his board, straddling it, while he watched the wave sets rolling in. His breathing slowed as he synced himself with the rhythm of the ocean, studying the waves, looking for the right one. The sky continued to lighten, casting a pearlescent glow across the water's surface. In the distance, the mountains of Oahu were emerging from the night's shadow, their silhouettes sharpening against the brightening sky. 20 minutes passed as Kai caught 3 decent waves, each one building his confidence for the day. The Kiumam, 4th wave he spotted was different, a clean face with perfect form rising higher than the others. He turned his board toward shore and began paddling hard, feeling the surge of water lifting him. In one fluid motion, he popped up to his feet, finding his balance instantly as the wave's energy propelled him forward. The wave hollowed out, creating a perfect barrel, and Kai crouched low, his right hand skimming the wall of water beside him. These were the moments he lived for, suspended in the curl of a wave, surrounded by water yet perfectly dry, moving at incredible speed, while time seemed to stand still. He emerged from the barrel with a spray of water, riding the remainder of the wave toward shore before cutting back to paddle out for another. Beneath the surface, 800 yards away, something ancient and powerful moved through the water with effortless grace. The female tiger shark was 14 feet of perfectly evolved predator, her distinctive dark stripes visible against her gray-brown skin. She had been patrolling this stretch of coastline for 3 days, drawn by the scent of a dead humpback whale that had washed up on a nearby beach before being removed by authorities. Though the carcass was gone, its lingering scent signature remained in the water, and the tiger shark continued to investigate the area. At approximately 800 pounds, she was not the largest of her kind, but she was experienced and in her prime. Her sensory systems, far more sophisticated than anything humans had ever engineered, constantly processed information from her environment. The ampullae of Lorenzini, scattered across her snout, detected the minute electrical fields generated by all living creatures. Her lateral line sensed pressure changes in the water caused by movement, and her olfactory system, perhaps most impressive of all, could detect a single drop of blood in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. This morning she wasn't particularly hungry, having fed on a large sea turtle the previous evening, but tiger sharks are opportunistic feeders with a remarkable degree of dietary flexibility. They eat when opportunity presents itself, regardless of hunger, and they are notorious for their lack of selectivity, their stomachs often containing everything from license plates to tires to boat cushions, consumed during investigatory bites that are a hallmark of their feeding behavior. The shark swam in a loose pattern, her powerful tail sweeping side to side in an energy-efficient motion that propelled her through the water without unnecessary exertion. She wasn't actively hunting, but neither was she ignoring her surroundings. Her brain, though small by mammalian standards, was exquisitely adapted to process the information most relevant to her survival and reproduction. The vibrations from Kai's paddling registered faintly on her sensory systems, but not strongly enough to command her immediate attention. Surfboards, with their long, sleek profiles and the paddling motions of surfers, can resemble seals or sea lions to sharks, a resemblance that accounts for many attacks. But distance and the fact that Kai wasn't the only surfer in the water, two others had arrived in the past half hour, meant the shark's attention remained diffuse rather than focused. Back at the surface, Kai was hitting his stride. The dawn had fully broken now, the sun climbing above the horizon and casting golden light across the water. He'd caught 5 solid waves and was feeling the pleasant muscle burn that came from a good session. More surfers were appearing in the lineup, a mix of locals and tourists he recognized from around the island. No one he knew well enough to paddle over and chat with, but the silent camaraderie of surfers sharing waves was comfort enough. "Looking good out there," called a young surfer with a thick Australian accent as Kai paddled back out after a particularly smooth ride. Kai nodded in acknowledgement, a small smile crossing his face. At his age, it was nice to get recognition from the younger crowd. Not that 34 was old by normal standards, but in the youth-dominated world of surfing, he sometimes felt like a veteran. The waves were building now, the rising tide bringing more energy to the break. Kai positioned himself farther out, watching as a set approached. The third wave in the set looked promising, slightly larger than the others with a clean face that suggested it would hold its form all the way to shore. He began paddling, matching his speed to the wave's approach, feeling it lift him just as he'd done countless times before. The takeoff was perfect, and he popped up to his feet with practiced ease. The wave was faster than he'd anticipated, and he adjusted his stance, crouching lower to maintain control as it began to barrel. For 3 glorious seconds, he was surrounded by a cylinder of water, his board skimming along the wave's face as sunlight filtered through the liquid ceiling above him. Then something changed, a subtle shift in the wave's energy, perhaps caused by an interaction with the reef below or a cross-current. The barrel collapsed a fraction of a second earlier than Kai had calculated, catching his board and sending him tumbling into the turbulence. It wasn't a catastrophic wipeout, just an ordinary hazard of surfing powerful waves, but it was enough to separate him from his board and plunge him into the churning white water. The leash connecting his ankle to the board pulled taut, and Kai felt the familiar tug as he was dragged through the turbulence. He relaxed his body, knowing from experience that fighting against the wave's energy would only deplete his oxygen faster. After 15 seconds that felt much longer, the turbulence subsided, and he surfaced, gasping for air and pushing his hair back from his face. His board had been flung ahead of him by the wave's force, and he began swimming toward it, powerful strokes carrying him through the water. The surface was choppy from the recently broken wave, slapping against his face as he swam. He was perhaps 20 yards from his board when something brushed against his leg. A touch so light, it might have been a strand of seaweed or a small fish. Except it wasn't. The tiger shark had detected the erratic vibrations of the wipeout, distress signals that triggered her predatory response. The splashing, the separation of surfer from board, the disorganized movements in the water, all resembled the thrashing of injured prey. She changed course, her curiosity aroused by these signals of vulnerability. Her initial pass was investigatory, a behavior common to many shark species before they commit to an attack. The brush against Kai's leg was the shark's highly sensitive skin gathering tactile information about this potential prey item. Had Kai been wearing a wetsuit, the shark might have detected the neoprene's texture and recognized it as inedible, but his bare skin combined with his board shorts fabric provided no such deterrent. Kai felt a jolt of primal fear as he registered the contact. His eyes widened as he scanned the water around him, seeing nothing in the morning glare reflecting off the surface. Every surfer in Hawaiian waters lived with the knowledge that sharks patrolled these same waters, but the statistical rarity of attacks allowed most to push this awareness to the back of their minds. Now that dormant fear surged to the forefront of Kai's consciousness. "Shark!" he yelled, his voice carrying across the water to the other surfers in the lineup. "Shark in the water!" The reaction was immediate. Two surfers who had been waiting for waves began paddling toward shore, while another who had just caught a wave and was paddling back out froze momentarily before changing direction. The word shark carries unique power in surfing communities. It is the manifestation of the shadow that lurks beneath every session, rarely seen but always present. Kai's board floated 10 yards away now, tantalizingly close yet impossibly distant. His survival instinct screamed at him to reach it, to regain the flotation and speed that might carry him to safety. He began swimming again, powerful strokes propelling him forward, his eyes fixed on the board as if it were a life raft in a stormy sea. The shark circled below, moving in a tightening spiral. Tiger sharks, unlike the more ambush-oriented great whites, often circle their prey before attacking, a behavior that allows them to gather more sensory information. She rose slowly through the water column, her dorsal fin briefly breaking the surface 20 yards to Kai's left, a flash of grey that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. A surfer on shore saw the fin and began waving his arms, pointing and shouting, "Fin! Left side, get out of there!" Kai's hand touched his board just as the shark made her decision. She approached from below, the classic attack vector for many shark species, her powerful tail propelling her upward with astonishing speed. The first Kai knew of the attack was a massive force striking his legs like being hit by a car. The shark's initial bite was exploratory rather than committed, her teeth sinking into the flesh of his right calf and thigh before she released him, swimming a short distance away to assess the results of her investigation. Pain exploded through Kai's body, a white-hot nova that momentarily shorted out all other sensory input. He screamed, a primal sound that tore from his throat before he could process what was happening. The water around him bloomed red as blood poured from the ragged wounds on his leg. Oh God," he gasped, clinging to his board now with desperate strength. He managed to pull himself partially onto it, his wounded leg trailing in the bloody water. Every movement sent fresh agony through his body, but survival instinct overrode the pain. He needed to get out of the water immediately. The scent and taste of blood in the water shifted the shark's behavior from investigatory to predatory. Tiger sharks, like most shark species, do not particularly like the taste of humans. We are not their preferred prey, but blood is blood, and in the predator's primitive brain, bleeding prey should be consumed before other predators can claim it. She circled tighter now, her attention fully fixed on Kai. The electrical sensors in her snout detected his racing heartbeat, the chemical signatures of his fear hormones, the vibrations of his desperate movements. All these signals converged to create a picture of vulnerability that triggered her next attack. On shore, people were shouting and pointing. A lifeguard who had arrived early for his shift was sprinting toward a jet ski parked above the tide line. But Kai knew no help would reach him before the shark returned. His only chance was to get to shore under his own power. He began paddling with his arms while keeping his injured leg out of the water as much as possible. Each stroke was agony, the exertion sending waves of pain through his body as damaged muscle tissue protested the movement. Blood continued to stream from his wounds, creating a slick on the water's surface that spread behind him. The shark attacked again, this time from behind. Her jaws closed on Kai's injured leg with greater commitment, teeth designed for slicing, through turtle shells easily severing muscle and tendon. She shook her head violently from side to side, a behavior evolved to tear manageable chunks from large prey. The force of the movement pulled Kai from his board, dragging him beneath the surface. Underwater, surrounded by his own blood, Kai experienced a moment of strange clarity. The shark was massive, far larger than he had imagined, her eye rolling back protectively as she bit down on his leg. There was no malice in that eye, no evil intent, just the cold efficiency of an apex predator doing what millions of years of evolution had designed it to do. Instinct took over. Kai hammered his fist into the shark's gills, one of the few vulnerable points on a shark's body. The blow wasn't particularly powerful underwater, but it was enough to cause discomfort. The shark released him, circling away before coming back for another pass. With his lungs burning for air, Kai kicked to the surface with his good leg, breaking through into the morning light with a desperate gasp. His board was 5 yards away, but he knew he wouldn't reach it before the shark returned. A new strategy formed in his oxygen-deprived brain. If he couldn't outswim the predator, perhaps he could outmaneuver it. Tiger sharks are remarkably agile for their size, but they cannot match the quick directional changes a human can make. Kai began zigzagging toward shore, changing direction every few strokes, trying to confuse the predator circling beneath him. The shore seemed impossibly distant, at least 100 yards away, but focus narrowed his world to the next stroke, the next breath, the next change of direction. The lifeguard had reached the jet ski and was launching it into the water, the engine roaring to life as he navigated through the shallows toward the bloodied water where Kai struggled. 2 other surfers, braver or more foolhardy than their companions, were paddling toward Kai as well, ignoring the cardinal rule of shark attacks: don't approach the blood. The shark made a third pass, but Kai's erratic movements confused her. Her bite caught only water as he jerked sideways at the last second. But the effort cost him. His injured leg was now barely responding to his commands, and blood loss was making him lightheaded. The shoreline wavered in his vision, seeming to recede rather than draw closer despite his efforts. "Hold on," shouted one of the approaching surfers, a young woman with a determined expression. "We're coming." Kai wanted to warn them away, to tell them not to risk themselves, but he had no breath for words. His world had contracted to the struggle for each forward movement, each gasp of air, each moment of continued existence. The shark attacked a 4th time, approaching from the right. This time, her aim was true. Her jaws closed around Kai's torso, teeth puncturing his side just below the ribs. The pressure was immense, like being caught in a vice lined with razors. She began to drag him down into the darker water where she preferred to feed. In that moment, an unexpected salvation appeared. The jet ski roared into the vicinity, its engine noise and hydrojet creating a confusing sensory environment for the shark. The lifeguard skillfully maneuvered the craft near Kai, the wash from its jet forcing the shark to release her grip or risk being struck by the powerful current. "Grab on!" the lifeguard shouted, extending a rescue tube toward Kai. With the last of his strength, Kai reached for the flotation device, his bloodied fingers closing around it with desperate force. The lifeguard throttled the jet ski forward, putting distance between Kai and the shark, towing him through the water at a speed no predator could match. The 2 surfers who had been approaching now turned and paced the jet ski, forming a protective escort as it headed toward shore. Behind them, the water continued to churn as the shark, confused by the sudden disappearance of her prey and the noisy intrusion of the jet ski, circled the area where Kai had been. As the jet ski reached the shallows, more lifeguards waded into the water, lifting Kai from the rescue tube and carrying him onto the beach. A small crowd had gathered, early morning beachgoers and surfers who had witnessed the attack from shore. Someone had called 911, and in the distance the wail of an ambulance siren could be heard approaching. Kai was only semi-conscious now, his body entering shock from blood loss and trauma. The lifeguards laid him on the sand and immediately began emergency first aid, applying pressure bandages to his leg and torso to slow the bleeding. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Stay with us, buddy," the lead lifeguard said, his voice calm but urgent as he worked. "Help is coming, just stay with us." Kai tried to respond, but found he couldn't form words. His mouth tasted of copper and salt, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He was cold, impossibly cold despite the warm Hawaiian morning, and he knew from his wilderness first aid training that this was a bad sign. His body was shutting down peripheral circulation to preserve blood flow to vital organs. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes after the call, its tires spraying sand as it pulled up as close to the scene as possible. Two paramedics jumped out carrying advanced medical equipment. They rapidly assessed Kai's condition, their expressions grim as they noted the extent of his injuries. Multiple deep lacerations to right leg and right torso, the first paramedic reported into her radio. Significant blood loss, BP is 80/40 and dropping. Patient semi-conscious. Requesting immediate medevac for transport to Queen's Medical Center. They established an IV line, pushing fluids to combat the hypovolemic shock caused by blood loss. A pressure bandage was applied to his torso and his leg was immobilized, with a specialty tourniquet designed to control massive hemorrhage. Throughout these procedures, Kai drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain so intense it became almost abstract, separating from his sense of self. In the water, the tiger shark continued to patrol the area where blood had been spilled. Her behavior had shifted from active predation back to investigation, circling the spot where her prey had disappeared, sensing the chemical signals of blood and fear that lingered in the water. After 20 minutes, with no further signs of vulnerable prey and the increasing presence of boats and jet skis in the area, she turned and swam toward deeper water, her mission neither successful nor failed, merely interrupted. The medevac. Helicopter arrived 15 minutes after being called, landing on a clear section of beach that lifeguards had hastily cordoned off. Kai was stabilized as much as possible on the scene and then transferred to the helicopter. The paramedics worked continuously during the short flight to Queen's Medical Center in Honolulu, fighting to keep his vital signs from deteriorating further. Male, 34 shark attack victim, the flight paramedic reported as they prepared to land. Multiple deep lacerations to right leg and torso, estimated 2 to 3 liters blood loss, 2 large bore IVs running wide open with saline. Pressure. Dressings in place but bleeding not fully controlled. Patient is unresponsive but maintains spontaneous respirations. A trauma team was waiting on the helipad as the helicopter touched down. 6 medical professionals moved with choreographed precision, transferring Kai from the helicopter gurney to a hospital trolley without interrupting the life-saving measures in progress. They rushed him through dedicated corridors directly to Kai Trauma Bay in the emergency department. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as doctors and nurses worked to save Kai's life. His clothes were cut away, revealing the full extent of his injuries. The shark's teeth had created deep, jagged wounds, some over 12 inches long, that had severed muscle, tendons, and blood vessels. The bite to his torso had punctured his abdominal wall but had miraculously missed vital organs. "Get 2 units ONEG up now," the trauma surgeon ordered, "and type and cross for 6 more. Call CT and tell them we're coming as soon as he's stable, and get vascular surgery and orthopedics. Down here, stat." Blood work, ultrasound, and rapid assessment confirmed what the medical team already suspected. Kai was in critical condition, hovering on the edge of survivability. The blood transfusions began immediately, along with medications to support his failing blood pressure. Antibiotics were administered through his IV. Shark bites carry a high risk of infection, their mouths hosting a variety of bacteria uncommon in human environments. 3 hours after arriving at the hospital, Kai was wheeled into surgery. The operation was complex, requiring a team of specialists to repair damaged blood vessels, reattach severed muscles, and clean debris from the wounds. The shark's teeth had left fragments in the wounds, not from the teeth themselves, which rarely break, but from Kai's board shorts and rash guard that had been pushed into the wounds by the force of the bite. The surgical team worked for 6 hours, their focus absolute, as they repaired what could be repaired and removed what could not be saved. Part of Kai's right calf muscle was too damaged to reconstruct, and a section of skin on his side would require future grafting. But the surgeons managed to save his leg, a miracle considering the force and location of the bites. As Kai was transferred to the intensive care unit following surgery, the morning's events were already becoming local news. "Surfer attacked by tiger shark off North Shore," read the headline on the Honolulu Star-Advertiser's website. Social media was buzzing with shaky cell phone footage of the rescue and second-hand accounts from witnesses. By afternoon, all the major local TV stations had run stories on the attack, complete with interviews with witnesses and background information on shark incidents in Hawaiian waters. In the ICU, Kai remained sedated and intubated, his body given the chance to begin its long healing process without the burden of consciousness. His vital signs had stabilized, though he remained in critical condition. The room filled gradually with machines monitoring every aspect of his physiological state: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, brain activity. A nurse sat at a station just outside his room, her eyes frequently checking the monitors for any sign of deterioration. As evening fell, Kai's parents arrived from their home in Kailua, their faces drawn with worry as they were escorted to their son's bedside. His mother, Ellen, gasped softly when she saw him, pale and still among the tubes and wires, his body so different from the vibrant, powerful son she knew. "Oh, Kai," she whispered, taking his unresponsive hand in hers. "What were you thinking, going out there alone?" His father, Robert, stood silently at the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable but his eyes never leaving his son's face. After several minutes, he spoke quietly to the nurse. "Will he make it?" The nurse's response was measured, neither overly optimistic nor pessimistic. "He's young and strong and the surgeons did excellent work. The next 48 hours will be critical, but he has a good chance." Outside the hospital, as darkness fell over Oahu, life continued its normal rhythms. Tourists filled Waikiki restaurants, locals returned home from work, and the waters of the North Shore grew calm as the day's wind subsided. In those same waters, approximately half a mile from where Kai had been attacked, the tiger shark continued her patrol of the coastline, her behavior unchanged by the morning's events. To her, the encounter had been neither success nor failure, just one hunting attempt among countless others in her long life. By morning, Kai's condition had improved slightly. The medical team had reduced his sedation, and he was beginning to show signs of consciousness, slight movements of his fingers, changes in his breathing pattern when his name was called. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Natalie Wong, explained to his parents that these were positive signs, but cautioned that Kai's journey was just beginning. The injuries themselves were severe but survivable, she explained, showing them scans and x-rays of Kai's wounds. However, we're watching closely for infection and compartment syndrome, swelling inside the muscle compartments that can cut off blood flow. The next few days will tell us more about his long-term prognosis. His parents took turns sitting with him, speaking softly about family memories and reassuring him of their presence. Though still largely unresponsive, monitoring equipment showed slight changes in Kai's brain activity when they spoke, signs that on some level he was aware of their presence. On the morning of the second day after the attack, as Ellen dozed, in the chair beside his bed, Kai opened his eyes. His first conscious sensation was pain, diffuse and throbbing despite the powerful medications flowing through his system. The breathing tube in his throat prevented him from speaking, but his hand tightened around his mother's, causing her to wake with a start. "Kai? Kai, can you hear me?" she asked, leaning forward. "Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." He squeezed, the small movement requiring enormous effort. Ellen pressed the call button, and within moments a nurse entered, quickly followed by Dr. Wong. "Welcome back, Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Wong said, checking his pupils with a small flashlight. "You've had quite an ordeal, but you're in Queen's Medical Center now. You're stable and we're taking good care of you." Over the next hour, Kai was assessed by the medical team. Finding him sufficiently recovered, they removed his breathing tube, a process that left him coughing and gasping but finally able to communicate. His voice was hoarse and weak when he finally spoke. "The shark," he rasped. "How bad?" Dr. Wong didn't sugarcoat her response, recognizing that Kai needed accurate information to process what had happened to him. "You sustained significant injuries to your right leg and torso. The shark," witnesses described it as a large tiger shark, caused deep lacerations that required extensive surgery to repair. You lost a lot of blood, but we were able to stabilize you and save your leg." Kai closed his eyes, absorbing this information. When he opened them again, they were filled with the beginning of tears. "I thought I was going to die out there," he whispered. "You very nearly did," Dr. Wong confirmed. "If not for the quick action of the lifeguard and the medical team, the outcome would likely have been different. You're extraordinarily lucky, Mr. Mitchell." As the day progressed, Kai's condition continued to stabilize. His mental clarity improved, allowing him to provide a statement to a police officer who arrived to document the incident officially. The officer, Detective Santos from the Honolulu Police Department, recorded Kai's account of the attack with professional detachment, though his eyes occasionally widened at particularly harrowing details. "We'll file this report with the Department of Land and Natural Resources," Detective Santos explained after Kai had finished recounting the attack. They track shark incidents in Hawaiian waters, and just so you know, the beaches near the attack site were closed yesterday, but they've reopened this morning with increased patrols. They should stay closed longer, Kai said, his voice stronger now. That shark is still out there. Detective Santos shifted uncomfortably. That's a DLNR decision, not police. But from what I understand, they don't typically hunt sharks after attacks anymore. The current policy focuses on monitoring and education rather than culling. This information didn't surprise Kai, who was familiar with the evolution of Hawaii's approach to shark management. Decades ago, the state had conducted shark hunts, following attacks, killing numerous sharks in the vicinity regardless of species or size. Modern understanding of shark behavior and ecology had led to more measured responses, recognizing that sharks were a vital part of the marine ecosystem and that attacks were exceedingly rare events that didn't justify indiscriminate killing. Still, as the victim of an attack, Kai felt a complicated mix of emotions about this policy. Intellectually, he understood it. Emotionally, the memory of those rows of teeth closing on his flesh made him wish for a different approach. Later, that afternoon, as news of Kai's improving conditions spread, a representative from the Hawaii Shark Encounter Response Team arrived at the hospital. Dr. Maya Kekoa was a marine biologist who specialized in shark behavior and had been studying shark-human interactions in Hawaiian waters for 15 years. "Mr. Mitchell," she began after introducing herself, "I know you're still recovering, but if you feel up to it, I'd like to ask you some specific questions about the shark and the encounter. This information helps us better understand these events and potentially prevent future incidents." Despite his fatigue, Kai agreed. Over the next hour, he provided detailed descriptions of the shark, its size, coloration, behavior before and during the attack, as well as environmental conditions and his own actions. Dr. Kekoa recorded everything, occasionally asking clarifying questions or showing him photographs of different shark species and asking him to identify which most closely resembled his attacker. "Based on your description and the wound patterns documented by the medical team, we're confident this was a large female tiger shark, approximately 12 to 14 feet in length, Dr. Kekoa concluded. This fits the profile of most serious shark attacks in Hawaii. Tiger sharks are one of the few species that will occasionally act as apex predators toward humans, though such behavior remains extremely rare." "Will it attack again?" Kai asked. Dr. Kekoa's response was measured. Contrary to popular myth, sharks don't develop a taste for human flesh or specifically target humans. Each attack is a unique event driven by specific circumstances. That said, tiger sharks are territorial and may remain in an area for extended periods, so there is always some risk. But statistically speaking, another attack in the same location remains highly unlikely. She left him with educational materials about shark behavior and contact information should he remember additional details about the encounter. The scientific approach to the incident provided Kai with a framework for understanding what had happened to him, a perspective that helped mitigate the purely traumatic aspects of the event. As evening approached on his second day of consciousness, Kai received an unexpected visitor. The lifeguard who had rescued him, a muscular Hawaiian man in his late 20s named Makoa Kealoha, stood awkwardly at the door to his room, still in his red and yellow uniform. "Just wanted to check on you, brah," Makoa said, stepping into the room when Kai gestured him in. "You gave us all a scare out there." "I'd be dead if not for you," Kai replied simply. "I don't even know how to begin to thank you." Makoa shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with being cast as a hero. "Just doing my job. Right place, right time." He paused, then added, "Been lifeguarding Pipeline for 6 years. First shark attack I've had to respond to, hopefully the last." They talked for 20 minutes, Makoa providing details of the rescue, that Kai had been too incapacitated to register at the time. The conversation had a therapeutic quality for both men, allowing Kai to fill in blanks in his memory and giving Makoa the opportunity to see that his actions had definitively saved a life. Before leaving, Makoa hesitated, then spoke more personally. "Look, I know a lot of guys who went through heavy stuff in the water, not shark attacks but big wipeouts near drownings. Just don't be surprised if getting back in the ocean isn't as easy as you might think, and don't be too hard on yourself about it." Kai nodded, though he hadn't yet allowed himself to think that far ahead. The idea of returning to surfing seemed abstract and distant, like considering a journey to a foreign country while still bedridden with illness. That night, as the hospital quieted and the lights dimmed in the corridors outside his room, Kai experienced his first flashback. He was dozing lightly when suddenly he was back in the water, feeling the massive pressure of jaws closing around his torso. He jerked awake with a cry, his heart racing and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. A night nurse hurried in, checking his vital signs and adjusting his medication. "Bad dream?" she asked gently. "Yeah," Kai replied, his voice shaky. "Felt real, though." "That's normal after trauma," she assured him. "Your mind is processing what happened. Try to remember you're safe now." But safety felt like a fragile concept to Kai as he lay awake for the remainder of the night, watching shadows move across the ceiling and listening to the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment. His body, which had for so long been his strength and pride, now felt alien and vulnerable. The ocean, which had been his sanctuary and joy since childhood, had revealed its capacity for indifferent violence. On the third day following the attack, Kai was moved from the ICU to a regular hospital room, a positive step in his recovery journey. Physical therapists began working with him, teaching him exercises to maintain strength in his uninjured limbs and assessing what rehabilitation would be necessary for his damaged leg. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic. With intensive therapy, he might regain 70–80% function, though complete recovery to his pre-attack abilities was unlikely. Later that day, a local news crew arrived at the hospital requesting an interview. Kai initially declined, feeling unprepared for public exposure while still processing his trauma. But after speaking with his parents, he reconsidered, recognizing that sharing his experience might help educate others about shark safety. The interview, conducted from his hospital bed, was brief but impactful. Kai spoke clearly about the attack, neither dramatizing nor downplaying what had happened. When asked if he blamed the shark, his response reflected his complex feelings on the matter. "Blame isn't the right word," he said, his voice steady. "The shark was being a shark, doing what millions of years of evolution designed it to do. I was in its environment, not the other way around. Do I wish it hadn't happened? Obviously. But surfing in the ocean always carries risks. This is one we accept, even if we don't think about it every time we paddle out." The reporter seemed surprised by his measured response. "Will you surf again?" she asked. Kai hesitated before answering. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "Right now I'm focused on healing, the rest we'll see." The interview aired on the evening news and was subsequently shared widely on social media. The comment sections revealed the polarized perspectives that often follow shark attacks, some praising Kai's balanced view, others calling for shark culls or expressing their own newfound fear of entering the ocean. As his hospital stay extended into its second week, Kai began experiencing the psychological aftermath of trauma more intensely. Nightmares disrupted his sleep almost nightly, and certain triggers, the sound of water running in the shower, the smell of the sea breeze when his window was open, could send him into momentary panic attacks. The hospital psychiatrist diagnosed him with acute stress disorder and explained that it might develop into post-traumatic stress disorder if symptoms persisted beyond a month. "This is a normal response to an abnormal event," the psychiatrist, Dr. Chen, assured him. "Your brain is trying to process something that falls completely outside your normal experience. It's creating these heightened responses as a protective mechanism." Medications helped manage his anxiety, and Dr. Chen introduced basic cognitive behavioral techniques to help Kai cope with flashbacks and panic triggers. Still, recovery was neither linear nor purely physical. On days when his body felt stronger, his mind often felt more fragile, as if the improving physical condition created space for psychological wounds to emerge. 2 weeks after the attack, Kai's medical team deemed him stable enough for discharge, though his recovery was far from complete. He would need ongoing physical therapy, wound care, and psychological support. The question of where he would continue his recovery became pressing. His third-floor walk-up apartment in Halewa was clearly unsuitable given his limited mobility. "You're coming home with us," his mother announced in a tone that brooked no argument. "We've already set up the downstairs guest room, and your father has built a ramp for the front steps." Kai knew better than to protest. Beyond the practical considerations, he found himself craving the security of his childhood home, a place where the ocean was visible but distant, where memories of safety outweighed those of danger. The journey from the hospital to his parents' home in Kailua was Kai's first exposure to the outside world since the attack. Seated in the back of his parents' SUV, his injured leg carefully positioned on pillows, he watched the landscape of Oahu pass by with new eyes. The island's beauty remained, but it was now overlaid with an awareness of its dangers that he had previously acknowledged intellectually but never fully felt emotionally. As they drove along the coast road, Kai's father deliberately slowed as they passed a beach where several surfers were riding small, clean waves. "Still looks good out there," Robert commented, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror to gauge his son's reaction. Kai said nothing, but his hands clenched involuntarily, fingernails digging into his palms. The sight of surfers in the water, something that would have filled him with longing and excitement just weeks ago, now triggered a complex cascade of emotions, yearning mixed with fear, envy tangled with trauma response. His father didn't press the issue, allowing the moment to pass as they continued their journey. But Kai knew the unspoken question would resurface eventually. Would he return to the water? To surfing? The activity that had defined his identity since childhood now existed in a nebulous space, neither definitively abandoned nor comfortably embraced. The welcome home at his parents' house was low-key but warm. His mother had prepared his favorite foods, and his father had rearranged furniture to accommodate his wheelchair. The downstairs guest room had been transformed with his belongings, brought from his apartment, surfing trophies from his youth, photographs of epic waves, books about the ocean. These artifacts of his former life created a shrine-like quality to the space, simultaneously comforting and disquieting. That evening, as he sat on the lanai watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Kai received a text message from an unfamiliar number. It was from Dr. Kikoa, the shark researcher who had interviewed him in the hospital. "Saw your interview. Impressed by your perspective. If you're interested, our research team could use your input on shark incident prevention education. No pressure, just an open invitation." Kai stared at the message for a long time, uncertain how to respond. The idea of channeling his traumatic experience into something potentially beneficial had appeal, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to immerse himself so fully in the topic of sharks. Eventually, he texted back a non-committal but polite response, saying he'd consider it once his recovery was further along. The days fell into a rhythm of physical therapy sessions, wound care, and psychological counseling. Kai's body healed faster than expected, his lifetime of physical fitness providing a reservoir of strength from which to draw. The wounds closed, stitches were removed, and gradually he transitioned from wheelchair to walker to crutches. But certain scars would never fade. The ragged line across his torso and the deep divots in his right leg, where muscle had been removed, would remain permanent reminders of his encounter. 1 month after the attack, Kai's physical therapist, a former competitive swimmer named Aiden, suggested they incorporate pool therapy into his rehabilitation regimen. The controlled water environment would allow for resistance training without putting weight on his injured leg. The suggestion made logical sense, but the thought of immersing himself in water, even the chlorinated contained water of a therapy pool, sent Kai's anxiety spiking. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he admitted to Aiden. "The pool is nothing like the ocean," Aiden assured him. "It's shallow, warm, and completely controlled, but I understand your hesitation. We can wait until you feel more comfortable with the idea." That night, Kai dreamed of the ocean for the first time since the attack. In the dream, he was floating on his board in calm water, the sun warm on his back. There was no fear, no shock, just the gentle rise and fall of swells beneath him. He woke feeling oddly peaceful, the dream lingering in his mind throughout the morning. During breakfast, he made his decision. "I want to try the pool therapy," he told his mother as she poured his coffee. 3 days later, he stood at the edge of the therapy pool at the rehabilitation center, wearing board shorts that covered the worst of his scars. Aiden stood beside him, patient and supportive. "We'll go at your pace," the therapist assured him. "How you can get out any time you want." Kai nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped down onto the first submerged stair. The warm water enveloped his foot, then his ankle, then his calf as he descended another step. With each increment of immersion, he paused, allowing his body and mind to adjust to the sensation. His heart raced, but not dangerously so. His breathing remained controlled. By the time he was waist-deep, the initial panic had subsided, replaced by a wary acceptance. The water here was clear and calm, nothing like the churning sea where he had fought for his life. By session's end, he had completed a series of gentle exercises and even allowed himself to float briefly on his back, supported by Aiden's hands. As Kai continued his recovery, word of his progress spread through the tight-knit North Shore surfing community. Former surfing buddies began to visit, bringing news of waves and competitions, treating him with a respect that bordered on reverence. In their eyes, Kai had faced the ultimate surfing nightmare and survived. This granted him a certain status, though it was a distinction he would gladly have forgone. 6 weeks post-attack, Kai received a visitor he hadn't expected, Mason Wong. A professional surfer sponsored by major brands and featured in surfing magazines worldwide, appeared at his parents' door one afternoon. "Hope you don't mind me dropping by," Mason said as they sat on the lanai. "I was on Maui when it happened, but I've been following your story. Wanted to check in, see how you're doing." Though they had encountered each other in the lineup over the years, Kai and Mason had never been close friends. The professional surfing world and the local free surfing community overlapped but maintained distinct identities. Mason's visit represented a bridging of that gap, a recognition that certain experiences transcended the usual boundaries. "I am doing better," Kai said, gesturing to his leg, which now bore only a light brace rather than the heavy immobilizer of previous weeks. "Getting stronger. Still not sure about getting back in the ocean, though." Mason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "No rush on that. Everyone has their own timeline." He paused, then added, "I got hit by a boat in Fiji 3 years ago. Not as serious as what happened to you, but bad enough. Took me 8 months to paddle out again. And the first time back, man, I was terrified. Shaking so bad I could barely stand on my board. But it got better, session by session." They talked for an hour, their conversation ranging from Kai's recovery to changes in surfboard design to the increasing crowds at once secret surf spots. By the time Mason left, Kai felt a subtle shift in his perspective. The professional surfer's visit had reconnected him to the world he had inhabited before the attack, a reminder that while his relationship with the ocean had changed, the community of people who shared his passion remained accessible to him. That evening, as the sun set over the Kulau Mountains, Kai walked down to the shore near his parents' home. Using a single crutch for support, he made his way across the sand until he reached the water's edge. The gentle waves of Kailua Bay lapped at the beach, nothing like the powerful North Shore breaks where he had been attacked. For several minutes he stood motionless, watching the water change colors as the light faded from the sky. Then slowly, he bent down and let his fingers touch the surface. The water was cool and familiar against his skin. He remained there until darkness fell, his thoughts as fluid as the sea before him. 2 months after the attack, Kai moved back to his apartment in Halewa. His physical recovery had progressed to the point where he could navigate stairs, drive, and perform most daily activities independently, though he still attended physical therapy 3 times a week. The psychological aspects of his recovery remained more challenging. He still experienced nightmares and anxiety, particularly when near the ocean, but he had developed effective coping strategies with his therapist's help. His return to the North Shore community brought him face to face with the site of his attack more frequently than he had anticipated. Pipeline was visible from certain spots in Halewa, and the surf break featured prominently in local shop displays, tourist brochures, and conversation. Rather than avoiding these reminders, Kai forced himself to acknowledge them, a form of exposure. Therapy that his psychologist had suggested might help desensitize him to the triggers. One morning in December, during his regular coffee stop at a local cafe, Kai overheard a tourist couple discussing shark attacks with evident misinformation. "I heard they hunt people deliberately," the woman said, her voice carrying across the small space. "Like once they get a taste for human blood, they keep coming back." Before he could consider the wisdom of involving himself, Kai found himself approaching their table. "Excuse me," he said, "but that's not actually true. Sharks don't develop a preference for humans, and they almost never attack the same area repeatedly." The couple looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting to be corrected by a stranger. "How would you know?" the man asked, his tone defensive. Kai hesitated, then rolled up the sleeve of his t-shirt, revealing part of the scar that wrapped around his torso. "I was attacked by a tiger shark at Pipeline 3 months ago. Since then, I've learned a lot about shark behavior from marine biologists. They're not the mindless killers movies make them out to be. The couple's demeanor changed immediately. Shifting from skepticism to fascination, they peppered him with questions about the attack and his recovery, which Kai answered with the measured perspective he had developed. By the time he left their table, he felt an unexpected sense of purpose. The realization that his experience, however traumatic, had given him a platform from which to educate others. That afternoon, he called Dr. Kekoa and accepted her invitation to contribute to the Shark Incident Prevention Education Program. 2 weeks later, he found himself sitting in a classroom at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, sharing his experience with a group of researchers and education specialists developing materials for public outreach. The most important thing I've learned, Kai told them, is that fear based on misinformation is more dangerous than fear based on facts. People who understand shark behavior and take appropriate precautions, avoiding dawn and dusk swims, staying out of murky water, not wearing shiny jewelry, are practicing smart respect for these animals. But people who think sharks are vengeful, monsters either avoid the ocean entirely or support destructive policies like shark culling. Dr. Kekoa nodded approvingly. That's exactly the message we're trying to communicate. Having someone who's experienced an attack firsthand share that perspective is incredibly powerful. By early January, Kai had become a regular contributor to the education program, reviewing materials and occasionally speaking to community groups about ocean safety. This work provided a sense of purpose during a period when his professional future remained uncertain. His job as a dive instructor was still available when he was ready to return, but he questioned whether leading tourists underwater was something he could do without anxiety, both his own and that of clients who might be aware of his history. Throughout his recovery, one question remained unanswered. Would he ever surf again? His surfboard stood in the corner of his apartment, untouched since the morning of the attack. Friends occasionally invited him to join them for sessions at less challenging breaks than Pipeline, but he always declined with various excuses: physical, therapy appointments, work with the shark education program, lingering pain in his leg. The truth, which he acknowledged only to himself and his therapist, was that the thought of paddling out into open water still triggered panic responses he couldn't control. In late January, as the winter swells peaked on the North Shore, bringing world-class waves and professional surfers from around the globe, Kai's avoidance became increasingly difficult to maintain. The energy in Halewa was electric, conversations everywhere centered on wave heights and conditions, and the roads were clogged with vehicles carrying surfboards to the legendary breaks. One evening, as he sat on the small balcony of his apartment, watching the sunset, his phone rang. It was Makoa, the lifeguard who had rescued him. "Hey, brah," Makoa said after they'd exchanged greetings. "Got something to ask you. We're doing a water safety demonstration at Waimea Bay tomorrow morning. Basic stuff, rip current awareness, what to do if caught in big surf, that kind of thing. Wondering if you'd come talk for a few minutes about shark awareness. Nothing major, just share what you know." Kai hesitated. Waimea Bay was one of the North Shore's iconic surfing beaches, different from Pipeline, but still very much part of the world he had been avoiding. "I don't know, Makoa. You don't have to get in the water," Makoa assured him quickly. "Just talk to people on the beach," but he paused. "It might be good, you know, being there, taking another step." After a long silence, Kai agreed. "What time?" The following morning dawned clear and calm, unusual for January on the North Shore. Kai drove slowly along Kamehameha Highway, passing the familiar beaches he had surfed countless times before the attack. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he approached Waimea Bay, his heart rate increasing, despite the breathing exercises he employed to stay calm. The parking lot was already filling when he arrived, but Makoa had saved him a space near the lifeguard station. The lifeguard greeted him with a warm hug and led him to where a small group had gathered for the safety demonstration. "Just a short talk," Makoa reassured him. "5 minutes max." Kai nodded, focusing on controlling his breathing as he looked out at the bay. The water was unusually glassy, small waves breaking gently along the shoreline. In winter, Waimea could produce waves over 30 feet high, drawing the world's best big wave surfers. Today, it looked almost benign, though Kai knew better than to trust appearances when it came to the ocean. When his turn came to speak, Kai stepped forward, facing the group of about 30 people, a mix of tourists and locals. He introduced himself briefly, then spoke about shark safety in Hawaiian waters, the species present, their behaviors, the precautions swimmers and surfers could take to minimize risk. He finished by emphasizing the statistical rarity of attacks. "I'm evidence that attacks do happen," he concluded, "but I'm also evidence that they're survivable, and they haven't made me hate sharks or the ocean. Respect both, fear neither, and you'll likely never experience what I did." The group applauded as he stepped back, several people approaching afterward with questions or simply to thank him. As the crowd dispersed, Kai found himself standing at the edge of the beach, his eyes drawn to the water. The sun had fully risen now, casting diamonds of light across the surface of the bay. "Beautiful morning," Makoa commented, joining him. "Water's warm for January." Kai nodded, unable to formulate a response as conflicting emotions surged through him. The beauty of the scene was undeniable, triggering the longing he had felt since childhood whenever he saw perfect conditions. But layered beneath that longing was the fear that had become his constant companion since the attack. "I have an extra board in my truck," Makoa said casually. "Nothing special, just an old longboard, super stable, good for small days like this." He paused, then added, "No pressure, just putting it out there." For several minutes, Kai said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where sky met water in a seamless blue line. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. 20 minutes later, he stood at the water's edge wearing borrowed board shorts and a rash guard, the longboard under his arm. Makoa stood beside him, his own board ready. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, word having spread that Kai Mitchell, the shark attack survivor, was about to paddle out for the first time since the incident. "We'll stay inside, near the shore," Makoa said. "And we'll come in any time you want. No expectations." Kai nodded, his expression a mix of determination and apprehension. "Let's go before I change my mind." They waded into the water together, Kai moving stiffly at first, then with increasing fluidity as the ocean enveloped him to his waist. He placed the board on the surface and crawled onto it, the familiar motion both comforting and terrifying. His heart pounded in his chest, but his breathing remained controlled, a testament to months of therapy and preparation for this moment. They paddled out perhaps 50 yards, not far by surfing standards, but an immense psychological distance for Kai. The water was clear enough that he could see the sandy bottom below, an environmental factor his therapist had suggested might ease his anxiety. There were no dark shapes lurking beneath, no shadows that might trigger flashbacks to the attack. For half an hour, they simply sat on their boards, occasionally paddling to maintain position, talking about nothing important. Kai's initial terror gradually subsided to a manageable anxiety, then to cautious comfort. The familiar sensation of floating on the ocean's surface, of feeling its gentle movements beneath him, reconnected him to a part of himself he had feared was lost forever. "Want to catch one?" Makoa eventually asked, gesturing toward a small set of waves approaching. Kai considered the question, assessing his readiness for this next step. The waves were small, 2 feet at most, nothing like the powerful breaks he had ridden before the attack. Finally, he nodded. They positioned themselves for the approaching set, Kai feeling the old instincts awakening as he watched the waves form. He turned the longboard toward shore and began paddling as the swell lifted him. The wave was gentle, offering neither the thrill nor the danger of the larger breaks he had once sought out. But as he felt the board begin to plane and then pushed himself to his feet, a different kind of exhilaration filled him. He rode the small wave all the way to shore, his stance widening and posture relaxing as muscle memory took over. When the wave finally dissipated in the shallows, he stepped off the board into ankle-deep water, his legs shaking, not from exertion, but from emotion. On the beach, a small group of onlookers applauded spontaneously. Kai acknowledged them with a raised hand, then turned to look back at the ocean stretching before him. Somewhere beneath those waters, the tiger shark that had nearly ended. His life continued its ancient patrol, neither malevolent nor benevolent, simply a perfect predator in its element. And here he stood, forever changed by their encounter, but not defined by it. He would never again surf with the carefree abandon of his youth. The scars on his body would always remind him of the ocean's capacity for unexpected violence. But as he stood on the shore of Waimea Bay, surfboard in hand and salt water drying on his skin, Kai Mitchell knew he had reclaimed something essential, not just his relationship with the ocean, but his belief in his own resilience. Makoa approached, From the water, his expression questioning. How was it? Kai considered the question, looking out at the horizon where the vast Pacific stretched toward infinity. It was a start, he said finally, a small smile crossing his face. It was a start. 3 miles offshore, the tiger shark that had attacked Kai continued her endless patrol of the coastline, driven by instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. If she retained any memory of the encounter with the human months earlier, it registered only as one hunting episode among countless others in her long life. She moved through the deep water with effortless grace, her purpose neither good nor evil, but simply to exist as she was designed to do, a perfect predator in a world where survival is the only true measure of success. As the shark swam deeper, disappearing into the blue vastness of the Pacific, the waters closed behind her, erasing all evidence of her passage just as they had erased the blood from that morning in September. The ocean kept no record of the lives and struggles that played out within its depths. It simply continued its eternal rhythms, indifferent to the human stories that occasionally intersected with its greater narrative. And on the shore, watching, the water with new eyes, Kai Mitchell understood this truth more clearly than most. The scars on his body would remain, permanent reminders of his brush with mortality. But the ocean itself bore no scars, no memory, no malice. It simply was, beautiful and dangerous, nurturing and destructive, a paradox as old as the planet itself. He would return to these waters again, carrying both his fear and his love for the ocean as twin passengers on his journey forward. And perhaps in time, the latter would grow stronger than the former. For now, it was enough to have taken the first step back, to have touched the edge of the vast wilderness that had nearly claimed him, and found that he could still recognize himself in its reflection.